The task of the 30th Corps and the 8th Corps during Bluecoat was to strike south and overrun the country between the Veer and the Orne, with the aim of preventing the Germans using the main feature, the Montpinçon Ridge, either as a bastion in their next defence line or as the hinge for a withdrawal across the Orne. Standing at the westward end of a long wooded ridge, Montpinçon is ideally suited for that purpose. An examination of the planning for Bluecoat indicates that the Allied armies were finally starting to get the hang of this bocage fighting. Most of the artillery concentrations fired would use air-burst shells, since the bocage banks and hedges absorbed the effects of ground-bursting ordnance. The British official history also comments that the 11th Armoured and 7th Armoured Divisions, mindful of their experience of the bocage during the Odon battle, had reorganised their 2 armoured brigades. They also had a brigade of lorried infantry, so as to provide each armoured brigade with an equal number of tank and infantry units. This was a wise, if somewhat belated, move. Close tank and infantry cooperation, while always desirable, was doubly so in the close country of the Normandy bocage. The tanks had to help the infantry against the enemy strong points and machine gun posts. The infantry had to protect the tanks against anti-tank guns, from well-concealed infantry armed with panzerfausts, or from snipers who could pick off the tank commanders in their turrets. Operating with the lid down was not possible in the bocage. The tank commanders had to stand up in their turrets to see the way forward and were extremely vulnerable to snipers while doing so. This close infantry cooperation also enabled the tank commanders to be more adventurous and thrusting. Many, especially those accustomed to the open deserts of North Africa, had at first found the bocage fighting unnerving and progress in the narrow lanes all but impossible. Once assured that they were not forging forward to become tiger fodder, that their flanks were being protected and that the infantry were in close support to deal with snipers and panzerfausts, the tank commanders were willing to push ahead and engage the enemy. The initial attack would be supported by the usual opening deluge from Bomber Command and the tactical air forces, but the fighter bombers and rocket-firing Tiffys, RAF Typhoons, would be kept in cab ranks, flying above the advancing troops and on call, ready to deal with any precisely located target. Hosing a leafy area with fire and rockets and hoping for the best was no longer seen as best practice since it led to too many friendly fire incidents. The infantry divisions, which had recently taken part in the Odon battles, were pretty tired, but by July 29th everyone was in position, and at 6 a.m. on July 30th, Operation Bluecoat began. Almost everywhere, says the official history. The troops were met by heavy fire as they began moving forward, but their biggest trouble at the outset was with minefields. A study of the map will be helpful at this point. The basic plan for Bluecoat called for an attack on a narrow front, with 30th Corps swinging south and east to a line between Villers-Bocage and Aulnay-sur-Odon, while 8th Corps swung out through Benny-Bocage towards Vire and Tinchebray. Once there, the general thrust was towards Montpinçon, where the 2 attacking corps would link up with the 12th Corps. 30th Corps duly advanced, the 43rd Division attacking another hill, Point 361, west of Jerquez, while 50th Division went for the high ground west of Villers-Bocage. Trouble began at Bricassart, 2 miles east of Caumont, which was stoutly defended by tanks and infantry and well protected by mines. The 130th Brigade of 43rd Division took Bricassart by noon, but 30th Corps made little further progress through the minefields that day, hampered by a stout German defence of every house and hedgerow. An example of what the troops were up against comes from the experience of the 6th Guards Tank Brigade on the first day of Bluecoat. Having advanced, they were deployed about Point 226 and ordered to hold the hamlet of Les Loges at all costs. At around 6 p.m, the Guards' tanks had just been joined by a company of infantry and were digging in for the night when heavy and accurate mortar and shell fire fell on their positions from somewhere in their rear. This in itself was alarming. Within minutes, 6 Churchill tanks were in flames and enemy fire was coming in from all directions. Then 3 German tanks, 45-ton Jagd Panthers, each mounting an 88mm gun, rumbled into the village and began to rake the British position with machine gun fire and solid shot. More Churchill tanks went up in flames, but the Jagd Panthers were alone, and in the face of stout resistance from the Guards' tanks and infantry they eventually withdrew, 2 being found later that day with their tracks shot away. There were still plenty of snipers about, and mopping up the Les Loges position took up most of the night. By midnight, a brigade of the 15th Scottish Division had come up in support and deployed their anti-tank guns forward of Les Loges to secure the position. It had been a close-run thing, and strong German tank and infantry counterattacks were to become a regular feature of the Bluecoat battle. Leonard Watson was with the 15th Scottish Reconnaissance Regiment. One of the many actions we were involved in was Bluecoat, the Cormont breakout. The 15th Scottish had moved secretly to Cormont, and we were well briefed for this operation with a bomber force to start the offensive provided the weather was good enough. I remember a Lancaster bomber appearing through a gap in the clouds, and a huge cheer going up as we thought our task would be easier. We could plainly see the bombs being dropped in front of us on Villers-Bocage, which was well demolished when we drove through it. Sergeant Nibbs gave us a nip from his hip flask as we drove down the hill through standing crops and backing out of a field labelled Minefield. At another hedgerow, I recall our sergeant firing at the glass of a German artillery telescope, and this hedgerow had been planted to look like the real thing, with deep trenches from which we soon extracted 5 prisoners. One had a gold watch which we liberated before handing them over to the Seaforth Highlanders. Shortly after that, I was knocked flat on my face by a sniper's bullet which hit the rim of my helmet. I could hardly believe this until I took off the helmet and found part of the bullet still in the rim. Fortunately, our helmets were of the type that came lower down than the infantry type, but I still had a terrible headache. We were mortared by moaning minis, and soon learned how effective German Spandau fire could be. Our carrier caught fire, another lost a track, and the driver was wounded, so we soon learned that a slit trench was essential. Sergeant Nibbs was badly wounded on his birthday, along with Corporal Chapman, Corporal Frost, Trooper Baker and Trooper Johnson. I still wonder what happened to that Scottish infantry officer we saw that day, being supported by 2 of his men, his legs shattered by a mine. Doug Peterson was a lieutenant in B Squadron of the 15th Scottish Reconnaissance Regiment. Bluecoat was my baptism of fire, and my orders were to carry out a simple recce from Cormont to the village of Bremoy and find out if it was still occupied by the enemy. The day started well enough, and we soon experienced the strange silence of no man's land, and crossed a fairly open piece of ground to reach a small wood. We passed a wrecked Daimler armoured car where first aid equipment and bloodstains indicated a casualty among the crew, but eventually reached high ground where it should be possible to look down on Bremoy. The crest was reached, the leading carrier halted as ordered, and then moved forward for some reason, but no more than a length. I was dismounting from my carrier, intending to walk forward when there was a shattering explosion. The lead carrier rocked to a halt, having run over a mine hidden in the brushwood. The crew suffered shock and ruptured eardrums, and careful inspection revealed another mine, and by now we were under intermittent mortaring from somewhere on our right. Observation from the hill failed to reveal any signs of enemy activity in the village, but I had to be sure, so I took a foot patrol down into the village where the only inhabitant was an elderly woman, chopping wood and clearly as mad as a hatter. We then returned to the carriers and sent the signal, Bremoy unoccupied. This event played no particular part in the campaign, but on reflection I was satisfied that I had been tested as had the members of the troop, and we had learned a great deal, something that stood us in good stead in the testing days ahead. Reg Spittle of the 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry describes the Bluecoat battle. Bluecoat was not like the other offensives, which lasted just a few days. Bluecoat went on for weeks, a real grinding battle with the circumstances changing day by day, hour by hour sometimes. We in the 2nd Yeomanry in our Cromwells were the odd job lads of the 11th Armoured, always pushing forward. Only the 3rd RTR had been in the desert, and a lot of us were still curious about the battle, and had a lot to learn about dying. We had a good start at Bluecoat, for the Germans appeared to be pulling out, and we chased them back. Then we got down to the Vire to Caen Road, and then it got harder. We were on the right flank of the 11th Armoured with no infantry support, just our 60 or 70 tanks rolling along. We should have had the Americans on our right flank, but there was no sign of them. All we had on our right flank was the Germans. The British 8th Corps had got along better on July 30th, moving astride the road to Beni-Bocage, but when they got there on the following day here too, resistance began to stiffen, elements of 21st Panzer and the 352nd Division appearing on their front at Saint-Martin-des-Bezasses. From then until August 3rd, Operation Bluecoat became a slogging match, most expensive in tanks and lives but successful in strategy. By August 3rd, 9 SS Panzer and 10 SS Panzer had been brought over from the east in an attempt to stem the grinding forward progress of the two British corps, but the Germans were always aggressive in defence and charged a heavy price for any ground given up. These German soldiers did not merely hold a position and defy eviction. Their response to any attack was a counter-attack from infantry and armour. This procedure made the British advance expensive, but did not stop it. On August 1st, the 11th Armoured Division of 8th Corps took Beni-Bocage and Guards Armoured Division battered its way towards Estrie. 30th Corps then sent 7th Armoured Division against Aulnay-sur-Odon and 50th Division, made ground towards Villers-Bocage. On August 2nd, 50th Division took Amaille and pressed on up the valley of the River Seulles. 8th Corps were then engaged in a hard battle on the outskirts of Vire, where the 2nd Armoured Division fought a stiff engagement against enemy tanks and infantry. Over that ground, against such resolute opposition, progress was inevitably slow, but in the context of the strategic objective of Bluecoat, that did not matter. The British aim was to keep German attention fixed, however reluctantly, on the retention of Montpinçon, while the Americans flooded out through the side door into Brittany and towards the Loire. Even so, Montgomery decided that this grinding progress called for some changes in command, and a Desert War veteran, Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks, replaced Bucknall in command of 30th Corps. The increase in enemy strength as more panzer divisions arrived on the Bluecoat front was then countered by the commitment of the 53rd and 59th Divisions of 12th Corps, which struck south towards Noyers and the Villers-Bocage road, which they crossed on August 4th. Further east, the armoured car regiments of the tank divisions were battling through the Suisse Normande, along the floor of the Orne Valley towards Grimbosque and Thury-Harcourt. With 3 British corps now engaged against a strong German opposition fighting in ideal defensive country, the battle on the Second Army front settled down yet again to a grinding process of attrition. Montgomery's account of the Bluecoat battle comments, "The German front began to firm up between Aulnay-sur-Odon and Vire. Desperate resistance continued between these two places because it was vital for the enemy to hold firm in this sector, while his forces to the southwest swung back." Montgomery then goes on to make some shrewd guesses about the current German dilemma. It was tacitly assumed on the Allied side that after the Saint-Lô breakout, the Germans would withdraw their forces to somewhere east of the Orne and form a new defence line in the east. This assumption was made by professional soldiers, and no one on the Allied side disputed it because it made professional sense. If the German forces could regroup behind the Orne, 7th Army and Panzer Group West would be buttressed by 15th Army, and could then conduct an orderly withdrawal to the Seine. As Montgomery comments, "From a strictly military point of view, he, the enemy, was now placed in a situation in which the only logical answer was a staged withdrawal to the Seine." A glance at the map will reveal the sense of Monty's assessment, but the illogical factor here was Adolf Hitler. The 7th Army, though supported by Panzer Group West, was in an increasingly untenable position in the first days of August. There were now 4 Allied armies in Normandy, and the superb quality of German troops and tanks would be increasingly negated by the crushing effect of superior numbers, by the loss of the defensive bonus provided by the Bocage and by Allied air power, which would grow even more fearsome once the protection of the Bocage was removed. By August 7th, there were 37 squadrons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force in France, operating from 11 airfields, and the 9th US Air Force was equally well placed. The Germans had fought a very good fight in Normandy for the last 2 months, but they could not reasonably expect to fight there much longer. The wild card in this assessment was Adolf Hitler. Retreat, even reculer pour mieux sauter, stepping back the better to jump forward, was anathema to Adolf Hitler, and this attitude presented the Allied armies with a further opportunity. If Hitler ordered his soldiers to fight on, there was every chance that the Allied armies could cut off and destroy the 4 German divisions in Brittany, and with any luck most of the German forces in Normandy west of the Seine as well. This fate was almost inevitable for the 7th Army. With the British and Canadians coming down from the north, the US First Army about to swing round and come in from the west, and Patton about to start bustling along the Loire to the south, the 7th Army divisions were gradually being forced into a pocket. The German line might have been broken at Caen, the first proposed hinge for the Allied line in Normandy. That hinge had held for a long time, but the failure to take Caen until early July was no great loss, as long as its retention forced the enemy to commit troops there. The next hinge was at Caumont, and that had now been broken. Then came a possible German hinge at Montpinçon. If that could be broken, the German forces west of there must fall back or be taken in the flank and rear. The resulting scramble would allow the Americans to press forward with greater speed on a line from Avranches through Mortagne towards Argentan and the Seine. What the Germans must not be allowed to do was to hang on to Montpinçon and use that as the hinge on which their forces facing the Americans could swing back east in an orderly fashion. To prevent such a move at whatever cost, the British forces pressed on across the bocage towards the slopes of Montpinçon. The advance continued and success came, but slowly. On August 5th, tanks of the British 11th Armoured Division were on the high ground northeast of Vire. The 43rd Infantry Division were moving up towards Montpinçon, and the 7th Armoured Division, which had made a slow start in this battle, entered Aulnay-sur-Odon on the afternoon of August 5th and sent tanks towards Thury-Harcourt, deep in the Suisse Normande, where the British 12th Corps were sweeping up to the Forêt de Grimbosque. The main delay now was caused by the terrible state of the roads through the Suisse Normande, which had been cratered by air attacks and had verges thickly mined by the retreating Germans. Sidney Jarry fought at Montpinçon as a platoon commander with the 4th Battalion, the Somerset Light Infantry. August 6th was Bank Holiday Monday, and my first battle in command of 18 platoon. The Battalion O Group was at 12:30 p.m, and we were to attack this rugged hill from the west with the 5th Wiltshires on our right and the 4th Wiltshires on our left. We were due to attack at 3 p.m. with a company leading on the right and B Company on the left. We followed B Company. The ground before us descended to a small stream at the foot of Montpinçon, and then rose steeply through typical bocage fields with thick hedgerows to a thickly wooded area. Inspection through binoculars failed to reveal the existence of any Germans. B Company moved off quickly with our company deployed about 300 yards behind. Their forward platoons had barely crossed the stream when concentrated Spandau fire came from the front and from both flanks. There must have been about 12 machine guns firing on them at one time, and this devastating display of firepower stopped the battalion in its tracks. There was no way forward or to the flanks, and no way to retire. Some of the guns engaged D Company over the heads of B, and one of my men, Private Morris, was killed. Powerless and crouching in a hedgerow, I tried to identify the Spandau positions. This proved impossible as they kept up this crushing display of firepower. In my ignorance, I expected that they would soon expend all their ammunition, but they did not. Nor did they do so in many subsequent battles. Captain Scammell, commanding A Company, was killed, and Major Thomas, commanding B Company, was severely wounded, and their companies were badly cut up. On our right, the 5th Wiltshires did no better, and with their CO killed and casualties mounting, their attack faltered. As the afternoon turned to evening, shelling and mortaring increased, much of it passing over our heads to isolate us from the reserve battalion. Shortly before dark, some tanks arrived, one of which crossed the stream and gave us some brave support, but it was not enough to get the attack moving again. Any movement to our front brought down instant and concentrated Spandau fire. Fortunately, the enemy did not seem to have any anti-tanks guns, so our armoured friends were comparatively safe. The fact remains that about 12 Spandaus had halted a battalion attack without our locating even one of them. As dusk fell, a new plan was made. C and D companies would advance through A and B companies and, using the cover of darkness, infiltrate the enemy position, climb to the top of the hill and consolidate. Not a shot was fired. By some miracle we passed right through their position without being detected. Our luck had changed. Up the hill we scrambled, through the trees to the rocky, gorse-covered summit. German voices could be heard in the mist, calling to each other unawares that we were now the kings of the castle. On that day, August 6th, 2 infantry brigades of the 43rd Division, supported by tanks of the 13th 18th Hussars, finally gained a foothold on Montpinçon after a hard advance from Ondefontaine, and as described later that day, aided by a squadron of tanks of the 13th 18th Hussars, which had found a passable uphill track through the woods, the infantry pushed up to the top of the hill. One of those taking part was Patrick Hennessy, a tank commander in the 13th 18th Hussar. We pressed on south, against heavy opposition, and came at last to Montpinçon, a hill around 1,200 feet high, which dominated the surrounding area and gave the Germans a great tactical advantage. Naturally, they wanted to hang on to it, and the capture of Montpinçon became a priority. The task was given to the 5th Battalion, the Wiltshire Regiment, with A Squadron, 13th 18th Hussars in support. On August 6th, we fought our way across to the foot of the hill, against heavy machine gun and mortar fire that took a toll of our infantry. The day was hot and sultry, full of dust and the stench of dead cattle, and every movement stirred up more dust, which brought down more enemy fire and curses from the infantry, who were in their shallow slit trenches, waiting for the order to cross the river and climb the steep scarp. The sappers were working to clear the mines from the bridge under cover of a smoke screen and a lot of enemy fire. Eventually the bridge was clear and we went across, the 13th 18th tanks followed by the infantry. We were halfway across when the enemy came to life again with machine guns and mortars, catching our infantry in the open. Within 2 minutes the leading companies of the 5th Wilts had been practically wiped out. The commanding officer of the 5th Wilts came forward to rally them, but was quickly killed and the attack petered out, though we were now on the far side of the river at the base of the hill. It seemed impossibly steep, covered with bushes and scrub, and we milled around in our tanks, dealing with pockets of enemy infantry, until, at around 6 p.m, we spotted a track that looked as if it might lead up the hill. I reported this over the radio, and we were told to press on upwards as quickly as possible. 2 tank troops under Captain Noel Denny went crashing uphill along this narrow path, with a high bank on our right and a steep drop on our left. Sergeant Rattle's tank slithered into a quarry and almost overturned, but we kept going. It was a good hell-for-leather cavalry action, and we reached the top and surprised the few Germans we found there, chasing them away and going into all-round defence. We felt pretty lonely up there, just 7 or 8 tanks with no infantry support as yet, but then a mist came down, and although we could not see very far, we could hear the Germans nearby. Fortunately, the infantry then arrived to consolidate the position, and we were very glad to see them. They had been in action all day and were absolutely exhausted by the time they reached the top of the hill. Only 7 tanks made it to the top of Montpinçon, and infantry losses were severe, the 5th Wilts, for example, being reduced to less than 100 men, but by the evening of August 6th, Montpinçon had been taken. Any chance of the 7th Army using this feature as the hinge of their withdrawal from the west of Normandy had vanished. George Treloar was a gunner in B Squadron, 13th 18th Hussar, during the attack on Montpinçon. I recall firing our machine guns and the enemy putting up flares to find us, but we got to the top on our own, and 1 man from each tank had to get out and act as infantry in the hedgerow, and while lying there I remember hearing the Germans talking. Finally the infantry came up, the Wiltshires having lost a company of men that day by the river. In the morning Lieutenant Aldham tried to shoot at a church spire, which he said was a German OP bringing fire on us and killing our infantry, but after 12 shots he had not hit it, so I asked if I could have a go. I set the crosswires in the corner of the tower of the church, put he in the breach and fired. The spire came crashing down, and a great cheer went up from the boys. On August 6th, 10 SS Panzer mounted a strong counterattack against the British advance between Vire and Montpinçon. This attack drove the 11th Armoured back a mile or so. Then the division rallied, the ground lost was quickly retaken, and on this day, with the taking of Montpinçon, the balance finally tilted against the German forces south of Caumont. From then on, a general and quickening advance began, south and southeast towards the Vire-Condé-sur-Noireau road and the Orne Valley. Guards armoured were heavily engaged but moving forward at Le Busque and Estry, and 59th Division of 12th Corps had crossed the Orne at Grimbosque, southeast of the shattered town of Villers-Bocage. Much of the fighting took place in the Suisse Normande, where steep hillsides, woods, flooded streams and small villages and hamlets strengthened the German defensive positions. Even so, the British attack pressed on relentlessly, the line shifting south towards more open country. The Germans still clung on to the far slopes of Montpinçon on the night of August 6th, but by the morning of August 7th a strong force of British tanks and infantry had been assembled on the hill. Advancing under cover of the morning fog, they were able to clear the far slope of the hill and advance towards the Vire-Condé road, 7 miles to the south. This success did not mean the end of Bluecoat, and the fighting continued. The divisions of the 8th Corps were engaged by the 10th SS Panzer on the Perrier Ridge, just north of the Vire road, and held there, with the 9th SS Panzer on their left flank closely engaged with the Guards armoured. The British armour was fighting well, and the 2 German panzer thrusts were thrown back on August 7th, having gained no ground. The skies now cleared, and hundreds of Allied fighter bombers ranged the skies south of Caumont, striking at any enemy movement on the ground. All was going well. The western end of the German line was in disarray, and it looked as if 7th Army would soon be either ground into dust or put into the bag if this southward thrust from Caumont could cut the German line of retreat towards the Seine. Then, on that day of August 7th, when all was going well but before the trap could be closed, the Germans struck back hard at Mortagne. Brittany and Falaise August 1st to 10th. Along the whole front now held by the 1st Canadian and 2nd British armies, it is essential that the enemy be attacked to the greatest degree possible. Directive from General Montgomery, Commander, 21st Army Group, July 27, 1944. Before moving on to the German counterattack at Mortagne on August 6th, it is necessary to go back briefly to the end of July and cover the progress of the US armies after Cobra. In this period, late July and early August, 2 new armies took the field, and there were some changes in the command structure. On July 23rd, the Canadian First Army under Lieutenant General H.D.G. Harry Crerar became fully operational. On August 1st, the US Third Army under Lieutenant General George Patton entered the fray, and with 2 US armies in Normandy, the US 12th Army Group was activated under General Omar Bradley. Canada had provided a notable contingent to the British Second Army since the start of the Normandy campaign. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had gone ashore on Juno Beach and struck out for Carpiquet on D-Day, after which this rugged and hard fighting division had taken part in all the battles of I British Corps. As more Canadian units arrived, the Canadian element expanded, first to Corps level for the spring offensive, and finally, on July 23rd, to Army level under Crerar. General Crerar had established his headquarters at Ambly in Normandy on June 18th, just before the Great Storm. After that, the chronic delay in building up the Allied forces inhibited the formation of the Canadian Army, which Crerar had been awaiting for some time, but now this army was ready to take the field. Canadian servicemen had been fighting in the European theatre for years, manning convoy escorts of the Royal Canadian Navy in the North Atlantic and providing an entire Group 6 group, RCAF to RAF Bomber Command. Canada had sent many fine units to the British Army in Italy, and the 2nd Canadian Division had provided the main landing force for the ill-fated Dieppe raid in August 1942. Les Varga of the 1st Battalion. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada describes his personal motivation. Until late in 1944, every Canadian soldier you saw overseas was an unconscripted volunteer. Whatever his personal rationalization for going to war, that Canuck was there because he chose to be there. As to what made me go to fight in a European war, that is an American idea, not a Canadian one. We never had a revolution. Our ties with Britain were facts of heritage and history that we never dreamed of turning our backs on. Hitler was a menace to the world, and that heritage and history were his victims, however far from our own peaceful country they lay. General Crerar had led the 1st Canadian Corps in Italy. Crerar was a calm, competent and experienced commander who enjoyed the support of another Canadian, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, who was rated, correctly, as one of the best corps commanders in any of the Allied armies. Simonds was to command the 2nd Canadian Corps in Normandy, where he displayed considerable talent in the handling of troops and the conduct of battle, and Crerar, who was steady rather than brilliant, was lucky to have him. General George Patton was a rather more problematic character. The oldest of the Allied generals, born in California in 1885, Patton was commissioned in 1909 into the 15th Cavalry Regiment. He served on the Mexican border in Pershing's expedition into Mexico against the bandit Pancho Villa in 1916 and went to France in 1917 as a member of Pershing's staff, transferring on arrival to the newly formed Tank Corps. The Great War ended before he could see much service, but Patton had meanwhile become a tank devotee. Although he went back to the cavalry when the US tank units were disbanded in 1920, he returned to armour as soon as those units were reformed in 1940. Patton entered the Second World War with the Torch Operation in North Africa, where, newly promoted to Major General from Colonel under Eisenhower, he took command of the Western Task Force. This force went ashore on November 8, 1942, but within 3 days the Vichy French had capitulated, and Patton spent the next few months as the military governor of Morocco, a political appointment and one not to his taste. George Patton wanted action. His chance came at last in March 1943, when he was given command of the US Second Corps, which had just been badly mauled by the Germans at the Kasserine Pass. Patton got a firm grip on the Second Corps, and at their next encounter on March 23rd, his troops fought the enemy to a standstill. As a result, Eisenhower gave Patton command of the 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily, where Patton led another storming advance and fell out badly with the British commander in Sicily, Bernard Montgomery. Things were going well for George Patton in 1943, when suddenly it all went wrong. When visiting a military hospital, Patton elected to slap a shell-shocked young soldier about the face and accuse him of cowardice. For an officer to strike an enlisted man was a court-martial offence in any army, and there was no excuse for it. But battle fatigue was not an ailment George Patton recognised. When news of this incident got into the press, and some accounts allege it happened more than once, there was a storm of protest. Patton was threatened with court-martial, obliged to apologise to his troops, and only saved from total disgrace by Eisenhower's personal intervention. Eisenhower decided that an army command was about Patton's limit, and when the time came to form up for Overlord, command of the US forces for the initial assault, and then of the US 12th Army Group, went to Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who had been one of Patton's corps commanders in Italy. Patton put his foot in it again in April 1944, making a speech in Britain declaring that after the war, the United States and Britain should dominate the world. This speech was widely reported, gave great offence to the Russians, and was deeply regretted by Patton's political masters. Once again, Eisenhower had to intervene, but he kept Patton around and gave him the Third Army because Patton was known to be a thruster, a general who would drive his men on, whatever the cost. None of the Allied armies had too many of these. As with Montgomery, George Patton's problem lay in his character. Patton was a war lover, arrogant and tactless, barely controllable by his superiors, hardly in control of himself, the epitome of the gung-ho, fighting American general, a latter-day Custer. This was the image Patton loved to portray. He was never seen without his steel helmet and his pearl-handled revolver, always ready for action, although by comparison with his detested rival, Bernard Montgomery, George Patton had not actually seen much action. This may have been part of the reason for Patton's deep and open dislike of Monty. By September 1944, without counting active service on the northwest frontier of India and in Palestine, Montgomery had had 9 years of frontline service in 2 world wars, in every rank from second lieutenant to field marshal. All the American generals put together could not match this experience, and Patton, for one, resented it. Apart from his personal failings, some of those who knew Patton well had no great faith in his military abilities. Bradley was less than enchanted to have Patton commanding the 3rd Army and the 12th Army Group, and admitted as much after the war, writing, "He, Patton, had not been my choice for Army commander, and I was still wary of the grace with which he would accept the reversal of our roles. I was apprehensive in having George join my command, for I feared that too much time would be spent curbing his impetuous habits." Bradley, ever honest, went on to say that Patton had proved a stalwart support in the field. Nor was Patton wildly popular with his soldiers. American generals tend to have nicknames, but Patton's army nickname, Old Blood and Guts, attracted the wry comment from 3rd Army soldiers, "Yeah, his guts, our blood." On this point, Jack Capel of the 4th Infantry Division writes, "When we became part of 3rd Army later in the war, we heard this rumour that Patton had actually swum across the Saar River to get at the enemy. I never met anyone who saw this feat, which was probably the invention of Patton's fertile publicity machine. We in the 4th Division were not admirers of General Patton. He was an accomplished battlefield commander, but more reckless with the lives of his troops than other generals we had served with. Patton's never-abundant stock of modesty and humour was also sorely taxed by the baiting he had to endure from the U.S. Army ETO cartoonist Sergeant Bill Mauldin, whose drawings in the U.S. Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, drove Patton frantic, and all the more so since Mauldin's cartoons were extremely popular with the troops, and Patton could not put a stop to them. Patton did have one gift that all frontline generals require. He was lucky. Luck is an important asset for any general, but was particularly important in Patton's case, for Patton took chances. Given the chance, he would press on, regardless of cost or the extent of the opposition, with considerable speed and energy. The quiet and retiring Bradley made good use of Patton's energy. A critic might call it recklessness, and to a certain extent the two men complemented each other, Patton supplying the speed, Bradley the weight. Patton's army had been gradually assembling in the cotton town during July, but Patton's involvement had been carefully concealed to maintain the fortitude deception as long as possible. As related, the first elements of the 3rd Army to arrive, Middleton's 8th Corps and the 90th Division, had been attached to the 1st Army for operations. Now 8th Corps would spearhead the American breakout into Brittany, tasked to take Rennes and the vital ports of Saint-Malo and Brest, while the rest of 3rd Army came on behind and headed for the Loire. This chapter will look at 2 moves in early August, advances which took place on the extreme flanks of the Allied front in Normandy. The American 8th Corps advance into Brittany, and the thrust by Simons's 2nd Canadian Corps down the road to Falay's Operation Totalize. Previous Canadian actions with 2nd Army have been covered in earlier chapters. The only point to be remembered at this time, early August 1944, is that the components of the Canadian 1st and British 2nd Armies were to some extent interchangeable. For example, the 2nd Canadian Corps came under the command of the 2nd Army after the fall of Caen and served with the 2nd Army during Operations Charnwood, Goodwood and Atlantic, the final taking of Caen. With the establishment of a full Canadian Army, the British Corps under Lieutenant General J.T. Crocker became an integral part of the Canadian First Army, and as the Canadian official history comments when Headquarters, Canadian First Army, became operational in July 1944, it had no Canadian divisions under its command at all. About half the troops in the Canadian First Army would always be British, and another significant element in the Canadian Army was the 1st Polish Armoured Division, which joined in August. Therefore, when Crérat took over his new army on July 23rd, His first task was a visit to Crocker on the following day. Their association began badly, with Crocker flatly refusing to carry out the orders Crerar had sent him on July 22nd. These orders anticipated the establishment of the Canadian Army and concluded that the immediate task of Oeuffer Corps was to gain possession of the road that runs south and east of Caen, from Bréville through Le Marais to Le Petit Homme. The aim of this task was to remove the chronic problem of German artillery fire falling on the little port of Ouistreham. Crocker was extremely dismissive of this proposal, which, he said, would cost him up to 600 casualties, and the operation was, in his opinion, not on. Further discussion failed to change Crocker's mind, and General Crerar was well within his rights when he asked Montgomery to replace Crocker with some more biddable corps commander. Montgomery was not over-endowed with competent corps commanders in Normandy, and reluctant to replace one who, whatever his faults, knew how to command men in battle. Writing to Alan Brooke on this affair, Monty said, "He, Crerar, had a row with Crocker the first day and asked me to remove him. I have spent 2 days trying to restore peace, investigating the quarrel and so on. As always, there are faults on both sides, but the basic cause was Harry. I fear he thinks he is a great soldier and was determined to show it the moment he took over command at 12 p.m. on 23rd July. He made his first mistake at 12:05 p.m. and his second after lunch. I have had both of them to see me, and I now hope I can get on with fighting the Germans instead of stopping the generals fighting among themselves." This letter shows an altogether pleasanter, gently humorous side of Montgomery's character. Monty managed to smooth the matter over, and it is worth recording that Crerar and Crocker went on to establish a good working relationship and ended the war together, and as friends. Montgomery clearly had a quiet word with Crocker, pointing out that Crerar was his army commander and had to be obeyed. The two men then had another meeting and ironed out their differences before Montgomery's directive M515 of July 27th, following the Cobra attack, landed on Crerar's desk. This stated, Point 4, "Along the whole front now held by 1st Canadian and 2nd British armies, the enemy must be attacked to the greatest degree possible with the resources available. He must be worried and shot up and attacked and raided, whenever and wherever possible. The object of such activity will be to improve our own position, to gain ground, to prevent the enemy from transferring forces across to the western flank, to oppose the American advance, and generally to write off German personnel and equipment. This sounds very like the aims for Goodwood. The immediate task of the Canadian Army was to hold as many German troops as possible on their front, while the US 5th Corps moved on Vire, and the British Second Army fought their way south from Caumont in Operation Bluecoat. These actions have been described in the previous chapter. On July 29th, Crerar elected to provide this support with an attack down the Axis Caen-Falaise road, with the objective of taking Falaise, Operation Totalize. This thrust south would be made by Lieutenant General Guy Simons's 2nd Canadian Corps, with the 51st Highland Division and the 33rd British Armoured Brigade from 1st Corps under command, joined later by the 1st Polish Armoured Division. During Totalize, Crocker's Wine British Corps would attack towards Vimont to cover the left flank of the 2nd Canadian Corps as it made for Falaise. These attacks were to go in as soon as possible, and not later than August 8th. The demands of Bluecoat for artillery ammunition then prevented the launching of this attack, but it was decided to blood the newly arrived 4th Canadian Armoured Division in effect, to give it some battle experience by committing it to another attack on the little town of Tilly-la-Campagne, which was held by units of 9th SS Panzer. The fighting around Tilly and Saint-Martin-de-Fontenay went on until the afternoon of August 5th, when the Canadian forces from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, as well as from 4th Armoured, were eventually driven back. Meanwhile, General Simons was proceeding with his plans for the 2nd Canadian Corps attack towards Falaise. Norman Richardson of the 4th Canadian Field Artillery took part in this attack. The Army Service Corps brought up ammunition for 2 days before the attack, dropping off cases of 105mm ammunition at each gun position and bringing in more all the time. The barrage started at 8:15 a.m. and lasted for more than 3 hours, after which we fired on targets called in by FOOS, who were with the infantry. In all, we fired fairly steadily for about 6 hours. As we moved to our next position, I saw my first dead Canadian soldier. By this time I had seen many dead Germans, but the sight of that dead Canadian was a shock. Unfortunately, this sight was so frequently repeated afterwards that I have forgotten most of the others, though it was always grim. I will never forget the first one, though. This forward position was on a forward slope overlooking Tilly-la-Campagne, and it was not a peaceful place. Jerry had no trouble spotting our guns when we fired, and shelling by Jerry was frequent, as were visits at night by Jerry bombers dropping anti-personnel bombs. One day an infantry platoon that had been in support came through and stopped with us for a chat and a smoke. As they arrived, Jerry threw over a few shells, and strangely, the infantry said they did not know how we stood this sort of thing, and they wanted to get back to the front line where they did not have to take so much shelling. On the other hand, we always admired the guts of the infantry who were up where that killing fire, small arms fire was more prevalent. I guess it is a question of what you get used to. Simmons knew that an advance towards Falaise would be difficult. Not only was the ground favourable to the defence, the enemy had been improving his defences for weeks, and had demonstrated just how strong his defence lines were during Operation Goodwood. Simons therefore told Crerar that for Totalize he would need another infantry division, another armoured division, and total air support from 2nd Tactical Air Force for about 48 hours, hence the addition of troops from Air Corps and the newly arrived Poles. With such assets, Simons believed that the attack on Falaise Operation Totalize, though tough, could still achieve worthwhile results, and D-Day for Totalize was therefore fixed for Monday, August 7th. Before following the fortunes of the Canadian Army on Totalize, we must now move to the western end of the Allied line and catch up with the progress of events in Bradley's newly established US 12th Army Group. The situation as August opened was that the German front had crumbled, and the US forces were trying to keep the enemy on the run, pushing south towards the Loire. The US First Army forcing the 7th Army back from the foot on the Cotentin, and allowing Patton's Third Army to push south towards the Loire and debouch into Brittany with the 8th Corps. Bob Sales was in this advance into Brittany with the 29th Infantry. When St. Lo fell, we were given a short rest. Then the 2nd, 8th and 29th Divisions were sent to swing down to the Brittany Peninsula. This was slow fighting all the way to Brest, and Brest was at the far end of that peninsula, and it took us a long time to clear it. Brest was a submarine base, but the Americans wanted Brest for its port, but Hitler had taken the troops there to fight to the death, and it took us a month or so to take Brest. In the initial plan, it had been thought that the reduction of German forces in Brittany would take several corps, or even the entire resources of Third Army. Now it appeared that the German forces in Brittany had been much reduced because many German units had been sent east to join the fighting in Normandy, an excellent example of how the demands of battle can change previously laid plans, although in this case to the Allied advantage. On the afternoon of August 1st, General Wood's 4th U.S. Armoured Division of Middleton's 8th Corps, 3rd Army, began moving on Rennes. The 4th Armoured Division made 40 miles that afternoon, and it soon became evident that a single corps would be sufficient for Brittany. This left the rest of Patton's army free for operations elsewhere. The U.S. official history states, "It had long been planned to turn the 8th Corps westward into Brittany as soon as the Americans reached the base of the Cotentin at Avranches. 8th Corps were to precede other units of 3rd Army which would clear the whole of the Brittany Peninsula. Now it appeared that 8th Corps could manage this task on its own. The German forces west of the Vire, reduced to around 16,000 men with a small quantity of tanks, were now in full retreat, broken into scattered groups and in no state to resist a strong push by the 7th Corps towards Villedieu-les-Poêles, a town east of Granville. Even so, the American advance was not fast enough for General Collins, and he brought forward his two best and favourite divisional commanders, Generals Hübner of the 1st Infantry Division and Barton of the 4th Infantry, to get a grip on the advancing units and keep 7th Corps moving. This achieved the desired result. By August 1st, 1 week after the opening of Cobra, the 7th Corps were at the base of the Cotentin, having advanced nearly 30 miles since they crossed the Saint-Lô-Perrier road on July 25th, a rapid advance in Normandy terms. 7th Corps had now outflanked the left of 7th Army and had only to turn east and commence rolling towards the Seine, while Patton sent his troops west into Brittany and south towards the Loire. The spearhead of this last move was made by Middleton's 8th Corps on the west coast. The advance of the 8th Corps towards Granville and Avranches had begun on July 28th. 2 spearheads, each consisting of an armoured and an infantry division, began the move, and Coutances, 20 miles north of Granville, fell that day, as already related. The advance to Avranches continued, barely checked by the scattering of mines and whatever opposition could be offered by those German units already in full retreat. The leading US divisions sustained only 13 casualties, including 3 killed on July 28th. The commanding general, in this case George Patton, was not pleased with the rate of progress. Pressure was applied to General Middleton, who duly passed on the message to Major General Gros of the 6th Armoured Division, now heading for Pontorson and Dole, urging him to put on the heat. General Wood of the 4th Armoured Division was doing just that while heading for Rennes, but repeatedly pointing out to his superiors that he was advancing in the wrong direction west and not east. The 4th Armoured Division then made even better speed against slight opposition, the usual factor determining rapid Allied advances in Normandy, and on July 29th, Combat Command B of this division advanced 10 miles and lost only 30 men. And so, against slight opposition, on July 30th, 8th Corps took Avranches. It was very important to keep up the pressure on the retreating German troops and not let the advance dawdle simply because there was no pressure in front to lean against. If the Germans were allowed to get away, or given a breather, or allowed to dig in, there would be plenty of opposition. Keeping hard on the Germans' heels was therefore highly advisable, and there could be no pause for celebration at Avranches. Besides, just taking Avranches was not enough. It was also necessary to take the narrow corridor over the Sélune River at Pont-au-Beau, 4 miles further south, to gain the one highway that would allow Patton's tanks and infantry to get round the corner at the foot of the Cotentin and over the Quesnon River into Brittany. It then transpired that the Germans had been reinforcing the troops in Avranches, and the battle for the town might not yet be over. This proved a false alarm. The advancing Germans were driven back with loss, and the vital Pont-au-Beau bridge was taken intact on July 29th. The way to Brittany was open. All Patton had to do was forge ahead and take the entire province. This fact was all too apparent to the commander of the German troops in Normandy, Field Marshal von Kluge. From his new HQ in Le Mans, von Kluge was now commanding OB West and Army Group B, attempting to coordinate the moves of the 15th Army, Panzer Group West and 7th Army, and find out what was going on elsewhere with his communications in chaos. He also had to stave off the demands of Adolf Hitler and the staff at OKW, who wanted to know where von Kluge had prepared his defensive positions and what his plans were for driving the Allies back. It is hardly surprising that on July 31st, von Kluge described the situation in Normandy as a Riensensauerei, a hell of a mess. On that day, July 31st, von Kluge informed the Führer that it was impossible to stem the American advance, that the only static defences he had were the ones the Americans and British had already broken through, and that a withdrawal from Normandy was now inevitable. The German defensive line had been stretched too thin and had been torn open in the west because it only had the necessary defensive depth in the east. Once General Hausser of the 7th Army had lost Coutances, he had lost the Cotentin. The large and mobile US forces in the west could no longer be penned up, and the American armoured divisions, so long limited by the nature of the terrain, were now making at speed for more open country. The collapse of the German position had also been noted at Schaeff. Having visited Monty's HQ on July 30th, Eisenhower wrote next day to Montgomery, "Your plan continues to develop beautifully. I learn that you have a column in Avranches. This is great news. Bradley must make our position there impregnable, and permit armour to continue thrusting." If there is any truth in the allegations that Eisenhower never really understood what Montgomery had been trying to do in Normandy since June 7th, which seems more than likely the coin had finally dropped. This is confirmed by another message, on August 2nd, in which Eisenhower urges that since enemy resistance seems to have disintegrated very materially in the Avranches sector, our mobile columns will want to operate boldly against the enemy. This they were already doing with bold thrusts by the armoured columns of Middleton's 8th Corps now racing into Brittany. The advance into Brittany by Middleton was a fast and bold advance, and largely a waste of time. There were very few Germans in Brittany, and they could have been penned up by small armoured forces, the French resistance, the FFI, and the Allied air forces. The sole object of sending an American army moving west was to take ports, but the two main ports, Saint-Malo and Brest, were held by garrisons which defied eviction for weeks or months until the ports they defended were in ruins. Saint-Malo was totally shattered, never used by the Allies, and had to be totally rebuilt after the war. The defenders of Brest held on until September 18th, the day after the British 1st Airborne Division landed at Arnhem in Holland, and Allied troops had already overrun Belgium and were hundreds of miles away on the frontiers of Germany. Lorient, the last Breton port of any size, and Saint-Nazaire both held out until the end of the European War. The Breton ports were needed after D-Day, because there, on the west coast of France, they could take in American transports full of men and material coming directly from the USA. There was, however, an inbuilt snag with this plan, as General Wood of the U.S. 4th Armoured Division had pointed out. These ports lie in the west of Brittany, a large elongated province reaching far out into the Atlantic, a rural province without good roads in 1944. While the Breton ports were being taken and cleared of obstructions, and this took months, the American armies were moving away to the east and north, to Paris, the Ardennes, Luxembourg, and the frontier of Germany. As a result, Brest and Saint-Malo were never of any real use to the Allies, and the Brittany campaign at the time it took place was a waste of effort. The Americans should have taken Brittany in late June or early July, as soon as possible after D-Day. That would have given them more space in which to expand, a place to absorb their new divisions and access to 4 ports close to the Normandy battlefield. They could not do any of this, however hard they tried, because German opposition in the bocage prevented the US armies getting to Brittany until August. Now it was too late, and this being so, the story of Brittany and its fading place in the Normandy battle can be quickly told. 2 armoured divisions of Middleton, 8th Corps, 4th Armoured and 6th Armoured, were sent west. The 6th Armoured rapidly outran its communications, at least with General Middleton. It did manage to communicate with General Patton, who tended to overlook the usual communications channels and deal directly with the divisional commanders when he deemed it necessary, and that is what happened here. The advance went quickly against slight German opposition, 4th Armoured Division reaching the outskirts of Rennes on August 1st. The 2,000-strong garrison of Rennes held on for 3 days before withdrawing on August 4th. American columns then pushed southeast towards Angers on the Loire, west towards Brest, and along the north coast of Brittany to Saint-Malo. Having placed a bet with Montgomery that his troops would take Brest within a few days, Patton told General Gros of the 6th Armoured Division to ignore all side missions and head directly for that port. Middleton, unaware of this order, told Gros he was not to leave either Dinant or Saint-Malo in enemy hands. When Gros halted to clear these towns, Patton appeared at his headquarters near Dinant, asked what he was doing there, and told him to push on. "I'll see Middleton," said Patton. "You go ahead to where I told you to go." Gros duly went to Brest, but he could not take it. The port and town had been strongly garrisoned, and when the investment began on August 7th, the defenders greeted the American troops with an abundance of artillery fire and beat back the first US infantry probes with loss. On August 8th, Gros sent in a message under a flag of truce, telling the garrison commander of Brest that resistance was pointless and surrender advisable. This appeal was rejected, and the garrison continued to resist the Americans for the next 5 weeks. The taking of Brest finally cost the US Third Army almost 10,000 casualties, and when it fell, the port facilities were unusable. Bob Sales of the 29th Infantry again. The Germans had these forts in the walls of Brest, and we lost a lot of good men getting them out of there. My friend Toad Paget got badly wounded there. He got away from me one night and into a cave, and a German dropped a grenade at his feet and tore his stomach right open. We got him on a jeep and took him away and to hospital, but we did not think he could live. He did live after many operations and is still living in West Virginia and a good friend. Finally, we made it to the high ground overlooking Brest, and one of the biggest air raids I have ever seen was sent over, and they bombed Brest, and we watched it. You would think nothing could survive that amount of bombing, but when we finally got real close to Brest, we put up loudspeakers and told them that they had to surrender as we had artillery on the high ground and could fire in point blank and just blow them to pieces. When they came out, there was over 30,000 of them down there. You never saw as many prisoners in your whole life, and this ended our fighting for a while as we were not close to the front anymore, as the front had moved all the way up into Belgium. Nor was Brest the only port to hold out. Saint-Malo, regarded by OB West as the best defended fortress on the west coast, was first besieged on August 4th and held out until August 17th. Forbidden to surrender, German troops then held out in the outlying positions and on offshore islands, denying the Allies all access to the port until September 2nd, although pounded by aircraft, artillery, and the guns of the British fleet, including the 15-inch guns of the battleship HMS Warspite. When the port and city finally fell, the city was in ruins and the port was unusable, destroyed beyond hope of immediate repair, as the US official history puts it. While the fighting at Brest and Saint-Malo continued, it is time to leave this sideshow in Brittany and catch up with the battles now raging in Normandy after the breakthrough at Avranches, beginning with the Canadian advance on Falaise, on August 7th, Operation Totalize. By August 6th, the British Second Army had reached the southern limit of its advance on the Vire-Condé Road and was swinging east, pivoting on the left-hand 12th Corps. To the left of the 12th Corps lay the 2nd Canadian Corps, which, as already related, was planning an advance on Falaise. This was an opportune time for an advance to the south. The Cobra breakout had obliged the enemy to shift divisions west from the Caen front. More German divisions had shifted west to oppose Bluecoat, and for the first time since D-Day, there was a fair chance of a clear run across the Caen-Falaise plain. On the other hand, the German divisions moving west from the Caen front were panzer divisions, and these were being replaced by fresh, strong infantry divisions, transferred from 15th Army von Kluge and Hitler, having finally realised that fortitude had been a sham. There would be no Allied landing in the Pas-de-Calais. Most of these divisions were intended for Panzer Group West. The 326th and 323rd arrived on July 30th, but the 84th Division, which arrived on August 1st, went west to shore up 7th Army against the Americans, and its place in the east was taken by the 89th Division. The point here is that while the enemy had moved some units out of the way, other units, admittedly smaller and without motor transport, had moved in to replace them. This being so, if the Canadian attack was to take advantage of these changes, it had better go in soon. Nor had all the panzers gone west. The Canadians would also encounter their old enemies, the 12th SS Panzer, which was dug in before Falaise, and the 1st SS Panzer, active south of Tilly-la-Campagne. During the first week of August, the Canadian forces waiting to advance had harassed the German forces to their front, maintaining the pressure in order to keep the Germans uncertain about the next Allied move. The general pattern from June 7th until now had been a series of attacks at either end of the bridgehead. This being so, the enemy might anticipate an attack south of Caen in the immediate aftermath of Cobra. Things were different now because Cobra had led to a breakout and been followed up with Bluecoat, but the Caen-Falaise line remained an important point on the German line, more so than ever after the loss of Montpinçon, and one they had to protect. To break this line and advance to the Falaise road was the purpose of Totalize. Monty issued a new directive to the Allied armies on August 4th, in which the tasks of Totalize were listed as follows. Object of the operation. A. to break through the enemy positions to the south and southeast of Caen, and to gain such ground in the direction of Falaise as will cut off the enemy forces now facing Second Army and render their withdrawing eastward difficult, if not impossible. B. Generally to destroy enemy equipment and personnel as a preliminary to a possible wide exploitation of success. The broad strategy of all the Allied armies was now to swing their right flanks round, pushing the Germans back and forming a common front north to south, facing east towards the Seine. With all bridges over that river destroyed and kept in ruins by the Allied air forces, the Seine was the barrier against which the German forces in Normandy could be pressed back and destroyed, but the Canadian First Army had first to gain enough space to swing its right flank round, and that meant an advance to Falaise. General Simons's plan for the 2nd Canadian Corps called for a 3-phase advance, with the usual massive air and artillery support. The first aim was to break into the German positions between Fontenay-le-Marmion and La Hogue. This would be done by a strong surprise night attack by 2 infantry divisions and 2 armoured brigades, with no prior artillery bombardment, but a massive bombing on the Corps front by 1,020 bombers of RAF Bomber Command. Then, Phase 2, the 3rd Canadian Division and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division would go in by daylight, with plenty of air and artillery support, and breach the 2nd German position between Haute-Mesnil and Saint-Sylvain. In the 3rd, or exploitation phase, 2 armoured divisions, the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish, would exploit the breach and push south to the high ground just north of Falaise Point 195 metres. That done, both armoured divisions would extend their front while keeping in contact with the enemy. The role of the other element in the Canadian Army, Crocker's Y British Corps, was a subsidiary one. This was all it could manage because its main units, 3rd British Infantry Division and 4th Armoured Brigade, had been sent to 2nd Army for Bluecoat, and other units had been transferred to Simons to support this attack by the 2nd Canadian Corps. Crocker's much-depleted corps was to hold its front, but advance in conformity with the 2nd Canadian Corps and cover its left flank. Simons's plan incorporated one very novel feature, the first ever use of APC's armoured personnel carriers, then called kangaroos, which were either tanks without their turrets or priest self-propelled guns without their armament. Unfrocked priests, in the jargon of the time. Putting the infantry into APCs and Simons is credited with the invention of the APC, provided the infantry with both protection and mobility. The only snag was that in these improvised APCs the troops had to dismount by clambering over the top, in full view of the enemy and exposed to fire, and not out through doors in the rear, as with the modern 21st century APCs. Before the attack was launched, 76 priests had been converted into kangaroos. They were to prove most useful and very popular with the troops, and the use of kangaroos became a normal feature of Canadian Army operations. Totalize began at 11:30 p.m. on August 7th, after half an hour of bombing in which 3,462 tons of bombs were dropped in the enemy positions by RAF Bomber Command. Not one RAF bomb fell on the Canadian positions. The armour and infantry made good progress to begin with, but the dark, then a thick morning mist at dawn on August 8th, and an intense smoke screen put up by the enemy to restrict visibility, caused a number of units to go offline. Their advance continued, and although the defenders of May-sur-Orne and Fontenay-le-Marmion put up a good fight, the defenders of May were only quelled after a hosing with fire from crocodile tanks. These positions were in Canadian hands by early afternoon on August 8th, and the Canadians moved south on the right bank of the River Laize towards Haute-Mesnil. Meanwhile, the Scots of the 51st Highland Division were pushing down the left of the Falaise road past Hubert-Folly to take Tilly-la-Campagne. Losses were not severe, but were higher in the marching units than in those riding in kangaroos. The 3 battalions in kangaroos lost a total of 8 men killed. The 4 battalions on foot lost 68 men killed, mostly by mortar fire. General Simons's invention was already proving its worth. The Germans had not been taken by surprise. Some reserves were available to the 89th Infantry Division, the only one on the attack front, including elements of 101 SS heavy tank with 19 Tigers and 2 flame-throwing Tigers. The 89th also had a quantity of 88mm anti-tank guns from the 3rd Flak Corps and Kampfgruppe Waldmüller of the 12th SS Panzer Division, which had 20 tanks, half of them Tigers, and was under the close eye of Colonel Kurt Meyer, who sent his men and tanks forward as soon as totalize began. The two forces collided at Saint-Aignan, where Captain Michel Wittmann, the commander of the 101 SS Heavy Tank Battalion, the man who had stopped the British tanks at Villa-Bocage in June, was killed by shellfire, or by tanks of the 2nd Yeomanry. The first phase of totalize went well, and it could not have come at a better time. With the launching of the German counterattack at Mortain on August 6th, the enemy forces available to support the 89th Division and Meyer's scanty forces north of Falaise were limited and could not be reinforced. However, the second phase of Simons's battle did not go so well and began to go seriously awry when the 4th Canadian Armoured Division had difficulty reaching its start line over churned ground, through other units halted ahead and under a steady rain of shells and mortar bombs. Exhortations to the divisional commander, urging him to push on, filled the airwaves from Corps and Army HQ, but little could be done. And then the USAAF bombers came in, and 24 of them dropped their bombs on the assembling Canadian and Polish formations. These bombs fell on the 1st Polish Armoured Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. 65 men were killed and about 250 wounded, including Major General R.F.L. Keller of the 3rd Canadian Division, who had led this division since D-Day. This short bombing landed some way behind the first-line troops and the advance units for this phase. Most of the Poles and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division crossed the start line more or less on time. H-hour for Phase 2 was 2 p.m. on August 8th. Thereafter, progress was slow and losses started to mount. The Polish Armoured Division ran into the Tigers of Kampfgruppe Waldmüller southeast of Saint-Aignan, and the sum total for the second phase was that neither of the armoured divisions, 4th Canadian nor 1st Polish, made anything like the planned amount of progress. General Simons ordered them to continue advancing overnight and make up the distance next day. One result of this was the loss of Halpenny Force, a composite force made up of the 28th Armoured Regiment, the British Columbia Regiment, and the Algonquin Regiment, a force tasked to capture the village of Bretteville-le-Rabais on August 9th. The Halpenny force moved forward from Haute-Mesnil at first light and then lost its way, eventually deciding to head for all it could see in the morning mist, a village on some high ground directly to its front. This high ground was, in fact, the ridge supporting the village of Estrée, 2 miles southeast of Bretteville-le-Rabais, which the force had missed in the dark. The force was now totally lost, out on its own, and coming up against strong elements of Kampfgruppe Wünsche of the 12th SS Panzer. The Kampfgruppe encircled the Halpenny force near Estrée-la-Campagne and shot it to pieces. In a day-long battle on August 9th, the British Columbia Regiment lost 47 tanks, almost all it had, and 112 men, while the Algonquin Regiment lost 128 men, including 45 killed. This disaster did not prevent some ground being gained. Point 195, just northwest of Falaise, was taken, and by midnight 11:59 p.m. on August 10th, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada were in a commanding position, a mile outside Falaise. This was a spearhead position, well in advance of the rest of the 2nd Canadian Corps, which fell back from that advanced point, most of the Canadian units lying east of the Quai Falaise Road. The main thrust of the 2nd Corps had been blunted by German resistance in the Quesnay Woods, 2 miles north of Falaise. This position was held by that resourceful officer, Kurt Meyer, who had assembled all the available tanks, 88mm guns and Nebelwerfer mortars in this position to back up some tough survivors of the 12th SS Panzer Grenadiers, who were determined to hold his position to the last man. The fighting for Quesnay Woods lasted most of June 10th, and the SS inflicted a considerable number of casualties on the Canadians before they fell back. Lewaga was in the fight at the Quesnay Woods. We were attacking the woods straddling the Falaise Road, the Quesnay Woods, and there were tanks in there. Nevertheless, we put in a brigade attack, Queen's Own my outfit on the left of the road, North Shore Regiment on its right, a frontal assault with 6 tanks off to the left, somewhere protecting the exposed flank. The idea was that we should go in that evening fight through to the river overnight so the main armour could cross the river next morning. Promises, promises. What we found was one of those little battle groups of crack troops set up to hold the gap. We set off at around 7 p.m, Able and Baker companies leading, Charlie and Delta to follow. Waiting at our start line, watching Able and Baker disappear from view, we heard not a sound from the woods from which these positions were masked from us by the high ground of a wheat field. We set off at 19:20 in a familiar deployed battle order, and about 100 yards into the wheat field, we found ourselves in stubble, and I was thinking on a beautiful killing ground. Why hadn't they used it, I wondered. Moments later, I had my answer. The stubble was raked by machine gun fire from God knows how many guns. They were waiting for the second wave us, which they knew would be coming up, and this killing ground had been kept just for us. I had never heard so many machine guns firing at me all at once. They were even using tracer, and you could see it smoking through the stubble. I watched one tracer pass between my legs and another go inches to the right of my right ankle. I was thinking that if I had been zigzagging, one of those would have got me. We had a new company commander, a captain on his first action with us, also his last, as it turned out. He'd taken off his pips because of a sniper threat from the woods and carried a rifle instead of a Sten gun or sidearm. The only one who looked like he might be the commander was me, moving in my usual place, 5 yards the other side of the radio man, carrying my rifle and a map satchel. When the shooting started, and since things were rapidly falling apart under the weight of machine gun fire, I started waving my arms about trying to get things organised. So guess who Jerry thought was in charge? We were still moving, running forward, and as we reached the top of the slope, there were 3 tigers at the edge of the woods. They had been creaming 14 platoon to our left, but now they saw the radio man and this jackass of a hero waving the troops on and dropped a set of 3 shells right on top of us. I was surrounded by dust and smoke and thought maybe now they cannot see me, but this was wrong because they were raking the open slope with machine gun fire. I went running out of the smoke and there was half a man lying there staring at me. We'd come to the regiment together in early 43. Ahead, 14 and 15 platoons had gone, disappeared. On my right, Coy HQ had disappeared, and I was thinking, God, where is everyone? I was still running, zigzagging now, trying to get out into the standing wheat, but my inner voice told me I was not going to get that far and had to find cover right now, and I found a mortar crater and dropped into it. A tank shell hit about 3 feet to the left of me, lifting me out of the hole and dumping me back in it, and I stayed there, playing dead. Playing dead is an act one cannot quite excuse of oneself, and I got out of there as soon as it got dark and made my way back to Battalion HQ and tried to tell the story, but I was confused and rambled a lot. When we had collected all those who made it back, we headed to the rear to regroup and pick up replacements. The way took us through the artillery area, and every time a gun went off I fell over and I kept falling, tripping. I was obviously suffering from some kind of shell shock, but fortunately no one thought I should be taken off to hospital. I say fortunately, because had that happened I might never have recovered. We had seen some of that, hospitals returning ruined men to us that could no longer last a day in the line. As it was, when the next action came along, I stayed and I survived. The stress caught up with me after the war. Anyway, let me add a little to round out that action in the woods on August 10th. The German unit there was Battle Group Kraus, one of 3 battle groups that Kurt Meyer had set up from the remnants of the 12th SS and the 89th Infantry Division, plus elements of the 85th Division that were just beginning to arrive in the area. I suspect the Americans could never imagine the tier-on-tier of defensive lines we had to penetrate to force the Camp-de-Falaise road against many of the elite of the German forces, and Patton's idiotic remark from the other side of the gap at Argentan, the one about coming across and driving us back to the sea for another Dunkirk, gave us about the same feeling about him as the one we had about the 12th SS we had to deal with on this side. With the failure to take the Quesnay Woods, which cost the leading Canadian rifle companies almost 200 men, Operation Totalize was over. It had been brought to a halt by stout opposition from well-trained German troops in good defensive positions, a little ill management at the start of Phase 2, and a lot of bad luck. Even so, the gains were not inconsiderable. Centre Canadian Corps had advanced 9 miles through that series of German defence lines and were now within sight of Falaise. On the other hand, the Germans were still in possession of that town, and it would take another full-scale attack to evict them. This attack, Operation Tractable, would not go in until August 14th, which allows us time to leave the Canadians in front of Falaise and turn our attention to events taking place further west, where, since August 6th, the German panzer divisions had been making a counterattack at Mortagne.